I'm a novelist and essayist, very preoccupied right now with politics beyond the nation-state context. And as Ben implied, I think, especially since this is the first presentation of the day, I want to think really about the context into which AI comes. What are the deep structural processes into which new productive technologies such as AI and robotics enter? And I will essentially argue that though some sort of free play of these new technologies sounds highly desirable, their purpose is already highly determined by aspects of politics and economics. And if we are to achieve that freedom of redesigning AI, we have to consider several subterranean levels that go to determining them. I should say also that I wrote this on the plane, flying through the night, or arriving late last night, realized that 13 hours wasn't enough to write this kind of thing, and carried on writing until about 8 o'clock this morning. So if this paper is slightly hysterical, I apologize. Who is designing the world? The question imposes itself, for at first sight, our global technological architecture, for all its stupendous scale and power, seems to suffer from serious design flaws. How could it be possible otherwise that the largest and most spectacular communities ever conceived by human beings, larger in many cases than the nation-states whose logic they rival, produce such banality in social relations? How is it possible that despite our extraordinary information systems, the distribution of planetary resources remains so inefficient and unequal? How is it possible, as inanimate products and machines wake up all around us into consciousness, talking, acting, and feeling with us, that we might be left so anxious and alone? We can imagine very different scenarios. We know that the reach and potential of our technological platforms is much greater than their actual use. In fact, we sense, as Felix Stalder puts it, that these platforms are actually rigged. They look as if they are neutral, horizontal stages on which an infinite variety of events and interactions might occur. But in actual fact, they are tilted sharply towards one corner, and all activity is confined to one tiny space. The rest of the expanse, though in theory it is freely available, is totally empty. No one ever goes there. So how does this happen? For Stalder, it is a result of the protocols which define the gradients, norms, and limits of technology space, the millions of interlocking agreements, standards, and algorithms into which business agendas and ideologies are encoded. So perhaps these protocols need a redesign. Perhaps design thinking can open up those vast technological vistas we have never yet entered. Perhaps designers, along with philosophers, artists, composers, poets, can create very different platforms for radical and exuberant visions of life, deploying technological processes and applications entirely unlike those we already know. Perhaps, as we enter the next decisive phase of artificial intelligence, designers can even help us avert the inhuman scenarios dreamed up by Hollywood and turn us towards some new technological communion. Perhaps, and perhaps not. There are reasons to be skeptical, if only because such weightless optimism about artists' freedom and creativity comes to us, first of all, from the very companies such as Google, apologies to our Google friends here, from the very companies such as Google who are driving the technology. And part of their purpose clearly is to sustain the falsehood that we, humans, are the clients of big data and that it works for our fulfillment. Of course, Silicon Valley is a big friend and funder of prophets, diviners, and oracles, of whom artists and poets are a subset. But tech firms employ artists as the Pentagon consults Hollywood, and it is not about human fulfillment. Silicon Valley's business is to turn the future into technological and financial monopolies, to invent this future and to turn it into an object of desire, even for those people who will lose themselves in it. This requires necromancy. That is where artists come in. Sane people do not claim a channel to the future. Tech firms feed off the visions of the delirious, demented, and possessed. But there are much bigger reasons to wonder whether our technological architecture is open to redesign. Because technology is not a self-contained system which can be adjusted on its own terms by changing a bit of code here and some equipment there. Technology is the infrastructural manifestation of a vast integrated system, much of it subterranean. And the technological apparatus cannot be redirected while the rest of the system remains intact. Of course, Silicon Valley ideology leads us to think the contrary. Technology is autonomous and advances according to its own logic. But that highly visible tech logic is used to conceal the other layers of historical determination, and it is these which produce certain breakthroughs while preventing others. Before we start to think about the future, it's worth dwelling for a moment on an example of this from the past, one given by the photographer and thinker Alan Sekula in his decade-long meditation on the sea, Fish Story, first shown in its entirety at Documenta 11. Of course, says Sekula, the development of freight containers in the 1950s and 60s was a technological innovation driven by considerations of speed and efficiency. But this is not to deny that containerization also had profound political and symbolic consequences, which may, in retrospect, appear to have been its primary agenda. Maritime and dock workers, after all, had always presented an extraterrestrial terror to landed capitalist interests. They were a lawless, drunken, whoring, muscular, anarchic mob, and they presented both the hope and the terror of revolution. Early 20th century mutinies in the Russian and German navies released energies powerful enough to bring down entire systems. This is why so many of the processes which were to take over all production by the late 20th century began with the transformation of maritime processes, where the need was most urgent. Totally automated ports, where self-driving vehicles were introduced as early as the 1990s, removed the need for dock workers. City-sized ships with a capacity of 20,000 containers sailed with crews of just 13 people. The denationalization of shipping, meanwhile, and the shifting of maritime jobs towards the third world proletariat removed the sea from the main political equation. Containerization was part of a world historical event, and it was entirely successful. The old port cities, London, New York, have entirely forgotten their fear of the maritime mob. This was a critical political victory for post-war capitalism. And in fact, the effects went deeper even than the political. The eradication and isolation of maritime labor ultimately made the sea itself disappear from consciousness, at least in the rich world. And this had profound cosmological consequences too. But I don't have time for those today. I want to return to the present and to the future. I will argue that the various innovations we refer to under the banner of AI represent the climactic point of a world historical transformation that has been going on since the 1970s. And in order to understand AI's significance, we cannot look merely at the technology. We need to look at the epochal forces of capital, politics, and erotics of which it is an expression. The first layer to consider is that of capital. What are the historical capital processes producing this current AI moment? During the 20th century, and especially after 1945, international autonomous capital suffered a series of serious setbacks arising most particularly from war and state politics. Since the 1970s, global elites have been in the process of reversing these setbacks, with the aim of restoring for capital the supremacy it knew in the 18th and 19th centuries. The spectacularly successful progress of this project so far is very familiar, for it has produced the landscape that is all around us, the expansion of elite wealth at a pace unrelated to the broader economy, the multi-trillion-dollar offshore archipelago, the restoration in the rich world of 19th century levels of inequality, etc. The restoration of large-scale international capital has been achieved in part through the creation, especially in Silicon Valley, of extraordinary new monopolies on a planetary scale. These monopolies were built with a comparatively trivial amount of work, which meant that they could remain just that, monopolies. A post-war industrial giant such as General Motors, by comparison, employed 600,000 people at its peak, and its plant was built with the input of many millions of labor hours. It was impossible for any group of individuals to monopolize this scale of enterprise. The ownership of General Motors was therefore widely shared. Any American family with savings owned a bit of it. Meanwhile, much of the profit was turned into salaries and pensions for its enormous number of workers. The economic impact of General Motors was broad and deep. Today's Silicon Valley giants, in comparison, have rather little impact on the general economy. Their original plant was built often by triple-digit workforces who put in just a few tens of thousands of hours of labor, a fraction of the old-style industrial giants, which meant it was possible for a small number of entrepreneurs and financiers to bring them to market without significantly diluting ownership. Uber is still privately owned by the founder and by a few large investors. All of these companies are also famously creative about avoiding both tax and salaries. As we will see, they're great believers, in fact, in people working for free, which means that little money escapes from them into society at large. Meanwhile, they achieve their vast valuations in part because, again, unlike General Motors, which rose at a time when there were 3 major car companies in the US and dozens around the world, the Silicon Valley giants are more or less uncontested in their own domains. These valuations, in turn, allow them to acquire and absorb new startups and to suppress competing ideas of what computing technology is actually for. What is the business of these companies? Many of their monopolies are built out of resources that were previously widely owned and distributed. What is the business of these companies? Many of their monopolies are built out of resources that were previously widely owned and distributed. The advertising and brokerage of private rental accommodation, for instance, or the contents of countless attics. Uber has created a major concentration of capital by replacing the activities of innumerable taxi businesses around the world. The economic activity of tens of thousands of bookshops was replaced by the single capital powerhouse of Amazon, whose automated retail platform is now valued close to $1 trillion. That's General Motors' valuation in 1964 in current dollars, with 600,000 employees. You can see that the other companies produce far more value per employee than General Motors. When WhatsApp was acquired by Facebook in 2014, famously it had 55 employees and a valuation of $19 billion. The primary economic logic of AI will be to convert other kinds of work into technological monopolies and therefore into capital, just as these previous conversions have happened with other kinds of productivity. Much of this work will be without precedent. Apps which supply novel services based on raw computing power, monitoring deals and opportunities, tracking performance, etc. But much of it will also replace pre-existing human work. Large corporations are currently calling in tech firms to advise them how to plan for the long-term obsolescence of entire corporate functions, accounting, legal, etc. In other cases, automated systems will simply capture the most valuable part of work so that expensive professionals such as architects or doctors can be replaced by low-paid system operators. Human labor is still the most valuable resource on the planet, and there is very little that can derail the conversion of this resource with artificial intelligence into new capital accumulation. In the next few years, we will see tech firms with valuations far in excess of what we see now, as well as the first trillionaire individuals. Operating system incumbents such as Google and Microsoft will greatly increase their hold over global productivity, as will some industrial powerhouses such as Samsung and Intel. I think it's also going to be a significant moment in the shift of capital ownership to Asia, this development of new artificial intelligence companies. The conversion of work, another resource that currently is infinitely distributed, into vast integrated private monopolies represents a new mode of capitalist production. This mode is already upon us, and perhaps we can already sense what level of economic passions it will arouse. But in case we need guidance, we need only to think at the ferociousness with which slave-based production systems were defended in the past. Across most of history, in the absence of any other universal currency, human labor was that currency, and major wealth was held not only in real estate, precious metals, and luxury goods, but also in concubines and slaves. We are no longer very attuned to this kind of wealth, so we tend to underestimate it, but it was extremely substantial. A slave in the 18th century United States cost the equivalent of a worker's annual earnings. If we take that in contemporary global terms to be about $10,000, we see that Thomas Jefferson's 600 slaves represented a capital investment in today's currency of $60 million. This gives a sense of what the Southern planters stood to lose in the event of abolition. But much more than that, the form of Southern capitalism was entirely dependent on human labor owned as capital. The South was prepared to destroy itself to defend this mode of production because it did not possess the know-how to turn land into profit with salaried employees. We are starting now to enter another version of such things in which productive labor, automated this time and therefore more socially stable, will be held once again as capital. And we will see once again how major industrial interests will lose both the know-how and the taste for dealing with salaried human employees. And like other labor owners before them, they will promote and defend the new mode of production with messianic zeal. To turn to politics. As we saw with containerization, the fact that AI is propelled by the pursuit of new efficiencies and wealth does not rule out parallel political logics. The libertarian politics of some of Silicon Valley's leading figures conflict with the liberal democratic principles that have governed Western life since the Second World War, and the political effects of AI, once again, will not be incidental. One of these political effects has been going on since the beginning of the current revolution of financial and technological elites, the proletarianization of the Western middle classes, who made such extravagant demands on the economic surplus in the post-war period. They came to believe, in fact, that they were the appointed beneficiaries of the capitalist system, and now they are being put back in their place. They are losing their bargaining power, and all the historical acquisitions they thought could never be taken away from them: their work, their education, their security. They believed that capitalism would always produce new kinds of high-value work to preserve their special status. But this time it is quite the reverse. That status is being stripped away. And as new middle classes emerge elsewhere, the system will not make the same mistake again. But the transformation of work has much wider and more fundamental political consequences too. Modernity itself arose from the recognition of the symbolic power of human labor, which is how the disenfranchised forced their way into Western polities during the industrial era. And any contemporary assault on human work is an assault also on the inclusive political ideals of the preceding epoch. It is obvious that the most startling capitalist growth of recent decades has not taken place in democratic countries. And the West, too, must now ask how well democracy might survive under a new robotic mode of production, were it, for instance, to render a large number of people superfluous to the world of work. To think about this question, we need to recall what the rise of labor did to unsettle the symbolic power of property in the West, and therefore its aristocratic politics. This was a process that began in the early 19th century and reached its zenith after the Second World War. Before that period, labor was essentially invisible, and property was the condition for political participation. All European states were dictatorships of propertied men. The taxation system, which is the foundation of the nation state, was blind to work. There was tax on property and commodities, but not on income. Art showed the pathos of property in its many forms: real estate, shipping, luxury goods, and animals and slaves. The world transformation of modernity emerged from the recognition of labor not only as productive power, but as symbolic power too. Labor burst into vitality in the early 19th century. Balzac's is one of the first truly modern voices. He understood the social totality in terms of the myriad kinds of work that people do. And he saw corporations, newspapers, and shareholders as the primary historical agents. Painting, and later photography and cinema, devoted themselves to the seemingly infinite task of representing human labor power. Marx was entirely of his age when he came up with his labor theory of value. Before that, value was entirely abstracted from production. In the industrial era, labor was power, labor was value. Labor could organize, strike, rise up, change history. Without labor, there was no industry. Labor was able to bargain with the state and remake the state in its own image as a huge labor cooperative. The purpose of the state and of capitalism, apparently, was to provide work. Work moved to the center of the taxation system, income tax, because it was the central civilizational principle. At our own point in time, of course, we can see that all this was made possible by a now declining mode of production, which alone was able to support a certain compact between capital and labor, state and citizen. For today, the West is returning to the 19th century situation. Property is once again acquiring much greater symbolic power than work. As salaries become stagnant and precarious, property and rental income of every sort rises in prestige. Real estate, financial instruments, intellectual property, the spectacular networked brand power of those sports people and celebrities whose fortunes follow the opposite logic of automated labor. For as the work of the majority becomes routinized so that anyone could do it, the aura of exceptional and irreplaceable physical beauty or talent explodes. The Silicon Valley giants are once again instrumental in producing this symbolic decline of work in the West today and globally. And this is not only because they automate human labor and convert it into property. They are also establishing unpaid work as a core reality of our time. Facebook has 2 billion members whose combined contribution of time to the company's platform could build the production capacity of General Motors hundreds of times over. But all of this work is unpaid. It is converted directly into property, not wages. As such, it does not circulate as taxation and has no political traction. And this model of unpaid work is now seeping back into the traditional economy, where all kinds of new work categories are being invented to allow employers to avoid paying salaries. But Google and Facebook are not like older companies, and this model does not disturb their commercial logic, because unlike, say, General Motors, they do not rely on the working majority for their income. Data companies earn nearly all their income from other companies. Industrial capitalism, of course, was based on the idea that everyone would work and so earn money to consume products and generate growth. Today we have the prospect of something quite different: pay nobody, charge them nothing, and circulate liquidity endlessly between corporations. An eerie capitalism with silent companies peopled only by owners and strategists, and elsewhere their retinues of therapists, trainers, masseurs, maids, nannies, prostitutes, and the like. And beyond that, increasingly militarized reservations where superfluous populations are housed. This, of course, is how capitalism was supposed to end. But we are in a historical moment, and just because these new tendencies might actually destroy the capitalist system itself does not mean they will not be pursued with great determination. Fantasies of death abound. The new monopolies seem to drive towards some magnificent end-time explosion. Silicon Valley CEOs are already building nuclear bunkers and artificial island fortresses. We should not believe in the self-regulatory power of this system. Finance is on its way towards total unreality, and the system has no moderation to bring it back. Nor is this that kind of apocalypse that is brought about by some demented pursuit of efficiency. As we have all seen in automated airports and supermarkets, workerless environments are not necessarily more efficient at all. No, there is politics here, everywhere, and the purpose of the spiritual destruction of work may take precedence over efficiency. Even before it is launched, the driverless vehicle proves that drivers are not needed and reduces truckers' bargaining power near to zero. The libertarian dream of a clean capitalism without worker demands, where billionaire monopolists are the sole agents of history, this is a fantasy of class transcendence and has nothing to do with banal calculations of profit and efficiency. The assault on work will certainly evacuate the liberal ideologies that have remained hegemonic for so long, and this might even be the main agenda. Perhaps we are moving towards pure market politics, as some on the American libertarian right propose, an end to previous social contracts, because the point may come soon when capital can no longer afford democracy. The last section, erotics and theology. So we've been considering AI as the fulfillment of an emergent mode of production. We should not be surprised, therefore, if it draws on energies deeper than money and deeper even than politics. We should suppose that it is part, too, of erotic and theological transformations, which also must be taken into account if we wish to redesign AI itself. Here it is important to point out that when we discuss the arrival of artificial intelligence, we are talking of two parallel technological thresholds. The first is the novel intellectual and analytical power of what Benjamin Bratton calls planetary scale computing. But the second is equally important. The integration of machines with other machines, a process which began long ago with electricity and telegraph, but which today reaches its climax, the integration of all machines into one mega machine of all machines. This changes the relative scale and intelligence of human beings and even such trivial machines as thermostats, automatic doors, phones, and dildos, because each one of these is a small part of one vast cosmic machine, and each one can deploy the totality of all knowledge. Computers and cars become fragments of the total machine, which is the size of the universe and therefore takes on divine attributes. But it is not a familiar divinity. It resembles pagan gods much more than the proximate godheads of Christianity or Judaism or Islam. It is a godhead that controls all the productive energies of the universe and is therefore endowed, like ancient goddesses, with stupendous fertility. It knows us, it communicates with us, it restructures our nervous systems and automates our conscience. But unlike the previous gods, it can emphatically not be imagined in human guise. It demands our awe and our adoration, but it is not ethical, and it does not seek to engage us at the level of theological or moral precept. For all its artificial speech and comprehension, we cannot pray to it or anything sentimental like that. It does not care about our assent or our belief. It is far too grand and remote and arrogant. It is a terrifyingly creative and destructive Godhead, and it speaks the language of appetite, like some rapacious mythical creature. And it is in touch with such vast and such deadly energies that we can never draw close to it. We are still the same frail and superstitious creatures we always were. And if we look at human theological history, it would be strange if a demonic force of this magnitude could arise without siphoning from human beings some of their libidinal power. And indeed, we can see in the phenomenon of internet pornography that this is exactly what has happened. For internet pornography, which is evolving rapidly into various forms of robotic sexual contact, is not a substitute for human sex. It is real sex between human beings and the global technological apparatus. It is a form of pagan erotic worship of the machine of all machines. It is in competition with human sex and diverts energies away from it. The object of desire in internet pornography is not this or that other human being. It is the protean infinity of the universal machine itself. Users have sex not with another human being, not even with a photograph or a video showing a human being, but with endlessly creative and fertile databases and algorithms. Internet porn, just like any shopping site, is organized with drop-down menus, search boxes, and user ratings, and that is precisely the source of its erotic appeal. In the world of sex with machines, technological attributes are erotic attributes, as we see in the reviews of so-called fucking machines conveniently offered for sale on Amazon.com. A woman asks of previous purchasers of such a machine, "Is there an Android app so I can control it from my phone?" It is clear that such questions are not merely practical. The erotic appeal, too, of the machine rests on its level of integration into the universal machine. We know that big data and artificial intelligence are fueled by harvesting our own intellectual and libidinal responses. It is natural that we be filled with awe at a machine that can steal such stupendous energies for itself and swell on them to such heights of power. Sex with the machine is our form of erotic worship of that universal storehouse of libidinal energy, the techno-market, that has been inflated to cosmic proportions by our own energies. This sex produces and continually magnifies its own object of desire. With every new techno-orgasm, the technological apparatus expands its hold over human libidinal energy. I said at the beginning, perhaps we may redesign the forms and purposes of AI. If we wish to do so, we must understand that these forms and purposes are overdetermined by monumental, multi-century capitalist processes. We must also contend with the epochal political ambition which seeks to diminish the symbolic power of work and so reverse the liberal democratic hegemony. And once we have done that, we must deal with our own religious and erotic selves, which have already adapted their structure to the adoration of our cruel and magnificent machine god. Thank you.